In the sweltering August of 1838, Reverend Thaddeus Blackwood delivered a sermon that would curdle the soul of even the most hardened Georgia sinner. Standing before his congregation, his family, and the enslaved people of his isolated plantation, he did not speak of forgiveness. He spoke of legacy. He announced that his 2 daughters, Elara and Sarah, would not be married off. They were to be consecrated, he claimed, as sacred vessels for a new Eden, a divine bloodline untainted by the outside world. And that bloodline would begin with him. The community was horrified by the rumors, but they had no idea of the theological nightmare Blackwood was about to unleash. By 1845, Mercy's End Plantation was a quarantined wasteland. The Blackwood name had become a curse. 24 people were dead or missing, and 12 unmarked children's graves rotted in the unconsecrated soil behind the chapel. What unholy experiment did the Reverend conduct in his isolated kingdom? And what terrible fate befell the children born from his divine madness? Before we descend into the darkness, subscribe to Forgotten AMC, ring that notification bell, and comment below with your state to let us know where you're watching from. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to a place that God himself seemed to have forgotten. Mercy's End was a name dripping with cruel irony. The plantation was carved out of the dense, oppressive pine forests of southern Georgia, 100 miles from any real authority. The air hung thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and decay, a place where secrets could fester undisturbed. Thaddeus Blackwood ruled this domain not as a planter, but as a prophet. He was a man whose faith had curdled into a grotesque form of arrogance. He believed he was in direct communion with God, and that the scriptures were not just a guide, but a personal mandate for his own greatness. His daughters, 18-year-old Elara and 16-year-old Sarah, had been raised in this suffocating piety. Their world was confined to the Bible and their father's increasingly strange interpretations of it. They knew little else but his booming voice, his piercing eyes, and his absolute authority. The infamous sermon in August wasn't the sudden break with sanity. It was the culmination of years of escalating fanaticism. He had convinced himself that mankind was fallen, and that only a new, pure lineage, a bloodline forged in the crucible of absolute faith, could begin the world anew. And who was more faithful, more pure, than he and his own untainted flesh and blood? He called it a holy covenant, a sacrifice for the future of humanity. To Elara and Sarah, sitting in the front pew, it was the sound of their world ending. The words he spoke were coded in Scripture, citing obscure passages from Genesis and Kings, twisting them into a horrifying justification for what he was about to demand. He wasn't a father anymore. He was an instrument of God's will, and they were not his daughters. They were the wombs from which a new, holy race would spring. That night, as the cicadas screamed in the humid darkness, he summoned Elara to his study. The terror was absolute, a silent, suffocating thing. There was no one to appeal to, nowhere to run. There was only the will of her father and the terrifying silence of her God. The psychological violation was as profound as the physical one. Reverend Blackwood's tyranny was built on a foundation of twisted love and spiritual blackmail. He didn't break his daughters with whips. He broke them with words of salvation. Every monstrous act was framed as a sacred duty. Every tear they shed a sign of their weak and trembling faith. Elara, the elder, endured it by retreating into herself. She became a ghost in her own home, her eyes vacant, her movements mechanical. The father she had once loved had been replaced by a divine monster, and her body was no longer her own. It was a temple for his unholy worship. Within months, Elara was pregnant. The news was not celebrated. It was recorded in the Reverend's ledger like a scientific observation. He monitored her health with a chilling detachment, reading passages about the Virgin Mary to her as her belly swelled. He was not expecting a grandchild. He was expecting a Messiah. Sarah watched her sister's slow erasure with a different kind of horror. Where Elara's spirit had fractured into silence, Sarah's had hardened into a knot of pure, unadulterated hatred. She was forced to tend to her sister, to witness the daily degradation, knowing her turn was next. The birth was a nightmare. The child, a boy, was born small and frail, with a weak cry that seemed to echo the sickness of his conception. He was not the robust prophet his father had envisioned. The Reverend's disappointment was palpable. He barely looked at the infant, declaring him a mere prototype, a flawed vessel that proved the process required refinement. He christened the baby Abel, a name that hung in the air like a death sentence. The child was sickly from the start, and Elara's maternal instincts, buried under layers of trauma, struggled to surface. She would hold him at night, this impossible child of sin and scripture, and feel nothing but a vast, empty coldness. The baby was a living symbol of her damnation, and his constant feeble cries were a relentless reminder of the sin she was forced to commit, day after day. The experiment, her father assured her, was only just beginning. While the whitewashed walls of the Blackwood home contained a silent, psychological war, the true history of Mercy's End was being recorded in the silent, watchful eyes of the enslaved. They saw everything. They saw the Reverend's holy texts in his hands and the devil in his eyes. They saw the light go out of Elara's soul and the fire of vengeance kindle in Sarah's. They were the ones who had to manage the grim reality of the Reverend's divine plan. An elderly midwife, known as Mama Tilda, was tasked with caring for the children. She had delivered dozens of babies in her lifetime, but these were different. They were born with a sadness in their eyes, a fragility that seemed to defy nature. In the privacy of the slave quarters, they were not called by the biblical names the Reverend gave them. They were called the Unspoken, children of a crime so profound it could not be named aloud. Mama Tilda did what she could. She administered herbal remedies for their constant ailments and whispered prayers that had nothing to do with Thaddeus Blackwood's God. She was a keeper of secrets, a quiet pillar of defiance in a world gone mad. As more children were born, both from Elara and now Sarah, the Reverend's madness deepened. His first prototypes were weak, and in his hubris he decided the bloodline needed earthly strength. He began selecting strong enslaved men, bringing them into the great house at night to be used in his monstrous eugenics experiment. This new horror added another layer of unspeakable trauma. These men were victims as much as the daughters were, forced to participate in the desecration of their master's family under threat of death. For the enslaved community, this was the ultimate violation, not just of the body but of the soul, blurring the lines of power and victimhood until nothing made sense anymore. Mercy's End was no longer just a plantation. It was a laboratory, and they were all trapped in the experiment. Mama Tilda began to keep a record, a hidden ledger where she wrote down the true parentage of each child, a desperate act of witness, ensuring that the truth of their existence would not be entirely erased by the Reverend's insane theology. Nature itself seemed to rebel against the sins of Mercy's End. As the years passed, a strange affliction took root among the Unspoken. It was a wasting sickness, a slow fading of life that no doctor could diagnose and no prayer could halt. The children would thrive for a few months, even a year, before a deep, unshakable lethargy set in. They would stop growing, their breath would become shallow, and one by one, they would simply slip away in their sleep. The small, unmarked graveyard behind the chapel began to fill. With each tiny body they buried, the Reverend's fervor grew more intense. He saw the sickness not as a consequence of his sin, but as a divine trial. He preached louder, his punishments became harsher, and his demands on his daughters became more relentless. He was a man wrestling with a devil of his own making, and he was determined to win. But for Sarah, the death of her second child, a little girl she had secretly named Hope, was not a trial, it was a judgment. It was the final, cracking blow to her spirit. The simmering hatred she had harbored for years finally erupted into a cold, clear purpose. She looked at her father ranting at the pulpit, at her sister who was now a hollowed-out shell of a person, and at the rows of tiny graves, and she understood that God would not be delivering any justice to this place. If there was to be a reckoning, it would have to come from her. Her grief transformed into a chilling, meticulous rage. She stopped crying. She stopped praying. She began to watch, to listen, to plan. She observed the way the overseer stored the kerosene for the lamps. She noted which nights her father drank the most sacramental wine. She started speaking to Mama Tilda, not with questions of comfort, but with quiet, pointed inquiries about poisonous roots and the nature of fire. The sickness had taken the children. Now a different kind of plague was coming for the father. It was the plague of a daughter's vengeance, and it would be far more swift and merciless than any disease. The end came on a turbulent night in the autumn of 1845. A storm rolled in from the coast, lashing Mercy's End with furious wind and rain. The sky, lit by flashes of lightning, was a canvas of apocalyptic fury, a fitting backdrop for the judgment Sarah was about to unleash. While the Reverend was in his study, deep in his cups and his self-righteous scripture, Sarah moved through the house like a phantom. She did not act with the frantic energy of a cornered animal, but with the calm, steady hand of a righteous executioner. With kerosene from the stores, she anointed the doorways of the main house, the chapel, and her father's library, his sanctuary of madness. She left one path of escape open for her sister Elara and the remaining few children, ushering them out into the stormy darkness and towards the slave quarters into the care of Mama Tilda. Then she lit the match. The fire was ravenous. It consumed the dry timber of the old plantation house with an unholy speed, turning the monument to her family's shame into a roaring funeral pyre. The Reverend, startled from his stupor, was trapped. The blaze was his final, fiery baptism. By the time the authorities from the nearest town arrived days later, all they found were smoldering ruins and a community of traumatized survivors who claimed the house was struck by lightning. The story was convenient, and it buried a scandal too dark to confront. The land was declared cursed and quarantined, and the Blackwood name was erased from polite conversation. The official record showed a tragic accident, but the true record was hidden away. A small, leather-bound ledger kept by Mama Tilda. In it, she had documented everything: the births, the true fathers, the deaths, and Sarah's final, terrible act of redemption. It was the only proof that the Unspoken had ever existed. Their legacy was not one of divinity, but of a profound and tragic humanity, born from one man's monstrous pride and ended by one woman's unbearable grief. What do you think drove Reverend Blackwood? Was it true faith or pure narcissistic madness? And do you believe Sarah's actions were an act of vengeance or an act of mercy? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this dive into a forgotten American horror compelling, subscribe to Forgotten AMC and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. These dark histories deserve to be remembered, and these silent voices deserve to be heard. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the shadows.